everyone? Okay, this thing is on. Good. Well, first of all, thanks for being here. It's quite late in the day, so I sort of have decided to start off with a story. And it is about airplanes. It's a real story. It happened for real in Scandinavia. You can actually check this out on Wikipedia after the presentation. Not wild. So, 1946, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway decide to found SAS, Scandinavian Airlines. I believe most of you probably have flown with this company sooner or later. No? Okay, good. It has a blue tail, dark blue tail. Everything goes smooth, and they start to fly people all over Europe and in the world. In the same period in Norway, we have a minor regional air companies called Brotens, and they were flying people mostly on the west coast of Norway. Because if you didn't know, on the east coast of Norway, you have basically nothing. The west coast is the one that welcomes more cities or towns. Everything goes smooth, so Scandinavian SAS is a huge company. It has no competitors in other Nordic countries. In Norway, there is a regional company. Everything goes fine. We move a little bit back in the future, 1993. Norwegian Air Shuttle is founded in Norway. And they do warm leasing for Brotens, which basically means they give aircraft, crew, engineers, anything that Brotens, the Norwegian regional air company, might need in order to fly people on the west coast of Norway. This is still a very small company, so SAS doesn't really care at all. In 2001, SAS decides to buy Brotens. And suddenly, they just come up to Norwegian Air Shuttle and say something like, thanks guys, thanks for the hard work. We don't need you anymore because we are a huge company and we don't need your aircraft, we don't need your pilots, we don't need your crew. So thank you very much, see you again in the future. Obviously, this wasn't really well taken by Norwegian Air Shuttle because they have spent money in that, but they were still a very small company. So as a reaction, in 2002, Norwegian Air Shuttle became Norwegian Air. Like if you have flown with Norwegian, you know they're called Norwegian Air and Norwegian Air International if they fly like in the US or in Asia. Turns out that in 2017, this small company, Norwegian Air, over the last 12 months has flown something like 29.66 million people, while SAS, the bigger company, has flown just 29.54 million people. So what's the moral here? Like there isn't a real moral in this story. It's sort of one of the nice stories you might want to tell during a dinner or such an event in order to just talk to people. But the interesting part is that Norwegian Air Shuttle have been able to use infrastructure, planes, and engineer. They have been able to adapt their company to new requirements, to new needs, and to a new market. And that's what we're going to discuss during the presentation. So is this the end? Unfortunately not. We still have something like 35 minutes. So just relax and enjoy your flight, as they used to say. So now we can actually start with the technical part of the presentation. A little bit of introduction. My name is Arianna. I'm Italian. That's a pizza over there. Currently living in Milan. That's a cathedral. But how do I know about this fancy story of Norwegian and SAS? And that's because I lived in Oslo for 3.5 years. And again, that's one of the stories that comes up during dinner, like company meetings or during Christmas events and things like that. In Norway, I have started working for Varnish Software as a field engineer. Field engineer is sort of strange job title, I do mostly support, pre-sales, and I get to talk to people. That's why today I'm here. If you don't know what we do at Varnish Software, we are the company behind the open source web accelerator Varnish Cache, and we do basically caching. We are also leader in caching big data, and I think today it's super important for today's topic. That's even more important. So what's in there for you? I'm going to talk about how to build your own private or hybrid CDN. So hopefully by the end of the presentation you will get something out of it. The idea is to actually start out with what's a CDN, why we have started implemented CDN in first place, how did they evolve during the last 20 years or so, and how did we arrive to this? Why do we need a private or hybrid CDN? And most of all, do I, as small company or medium company, really need a private or hybrid CDN? And if the answer is yes, and it will be yes, otherwise I don't have 30 minutes to talk about, we will see how to build one. And there will be a small use case at the very end of the presentation. Okay, so what's a CDN? How many of you know, or how many of you don't know what a CDN is? Okay, again, I guess we can skip this one. So, well, a CDN, it's a content delivery network, and to be fair, I'm pretty young, and the first CDN comes from the 90s or so, and I sort of imagine two people working on the same project, one sitting in Europe and the other one sitting in the US, and they need to share that data at some point. How do we solve this? Easy. Let's put a storage in the US, let's put a storage in Europe, and let's just buy a super long cable and let's put it under sea and let's exchange data, and we still don't care about performance at this point in time. So that's basically what the CDN were trying to solve, at least at the very beginning of the 90s. Now I guess it's not about exchanging data, it's about exchanging data, delivering content, being performant, be reliable, be fast, and providing everything an end user wants to see and check out. So we usually talk about two different generations. Actually, there is a question mark over there, because while I was researching the topic for this presentation, someone in the wonderful world of the internet mentioned that we are now into the fourth generations of CDN. I don't know if that's true. I'm pretty sure you can't really give a name to the historical period you're living in, so we gotta wait a few more years before we can make sure we're either into the third or still the second, or we're into the fourth generation of CDNs. For sure, we got a change between the 90s and 2000 and 2010. So in the 90s, when we first developed the first CDNs, the idea was to deliver static and dynamic content with no performance in mind at all. Like, it could have taken days. We just didn't care. We just had to exchange data. That's it. And then at some point, video on demand came, streaming came, and the big data came as well. And that's 2000 and 2000. I would say between 2000 and 2010 or so. And that's where we have started to give a lot of importance to performance and reliability. So that's why we really talk about two different generations. We're definitely into the second generation, and we're possibly reaching a peak because we are also moving into another type of CDN. And we definitely give a lot of importance to speed, time to first byte, 100% availability. We need to be scalable. We need to be available 100%, otherwise we lose money and users. So we're definitely we're ramping up towards at least the third generation, I think. On this line, we can continue with the trend of CDNs. I don't know. Very beginning, content delivering and storage. Just imagine big data center on the west coast of the US, on the east coast of the US, and in Europe. That's it, super easy, nothing else to be done. And suddenly, service providers sort of understood, well, my audience is growing and I need to cover, I have audience in Europe, I have audience in the US, I have an audience in China. China is usually a very difficult market to penetrate when it comes to CDN, and that's where we moved on to the multi-CDN approach. So the same service providers will subscribe 2 or 3 different contracts with 2 or 3 different commercial CDN providers in order to be able to reach the audience and cover everyone. And that is due to, well, first of all, nowadays everyone is able to, everyone in Europe, the US, and I will say the Western country is able to connect to the internet, so the audience is growing day after day. The content type is changing because we want to see more live content, and also we want to see more content. I basically check everything using my smartphone. I have no books at home, I'm afraid. And this obviously led us to the last and the topic for today, and that's a do-it-yourself CDN. It can either be a private or hybrid CDN. So after the multi-CDN trend, someone, big player usually, sort of understood like, okay, we are huge players, we have good teams, we have infrastructures, we have no problem in expanding our market. Why don't we just control and build our own CDN? So that's what Google did. Google is a huge player in the tech world. And for them, it's definitely cheaper to buy infrastructure, to hire new people, to educate those new people, and to be able to control the content they want to push, how they want to push it, and make sure they are responsible for whatever they are delivering. They don't want a third-party CDN to be responsible for their own content. And that's how they managed to build a private CDN. When we talk about hybrid CDN instead, that's probably the solution you might want to have a look at if you're a medium-sized company. Hybrid CDN basically means that you're still using a third-party CDN, but on the top of that content delivery, you're going to build your own. So you're boosting that third-party CDN. And that's because commercial CDNs, they simply provide a service, and they do provide a service to you and to hundreds of other companies. So they can't really tweak performance just for your personal use case. If you want to make sure you're optimizing your content delivery, you gotta do it yourself. That's it. So there was, pardon me, but I don't remember the name of this Microsoft scientist, but it said that if you do have two different websites, competitor websites, and one of those 2 websites takes 250 milliseconds more than the other website, that's less than a blink of an eye, the user visiting those 2 websites will prefer the faster one. 250 milliseconds, it's something you can't really recognize at all, but somehow you will lose the user for just 250 milliseconds. So that's the point in history where we are at. Okay, so we sort of understood requirements are changing, market is changing, we want to have control over our infrastructure, we want to make sure to be fast, reliable, and the speed is everything. So now that we know that everything is changing, what do you need to, there are 5 points you need to consider and in order to understand if you need a do-it-yourself CDN or not. First one, availability. You gotta be available 100% all the time. I mean, I'm not talking about Black Friday. That's a day you gotta be available for sure, but I'm talking about every other day of the year, like Christmas Day. That's usually a day where people are not surfing the web that much. You have to be available, because if your service is not available, the user will blame you and not the CDN provider. If I want to stream a movie and I can't stream that movie, I'm never going to think that's the CDN provider fault because something has happened, I don't know, the data center is on fire. That's a streaming provider. I mean, I'm going to blame the streaming provider for sure. I'm going to find another one. Super easy solution. So do you need to be available all the time? Usually the answer is yes. Do you need to be responsible for your availability? And that's usually yes as well. Point 1. Point 2, performance. So commercial CDNs, there are tons of commercial CDNs providers out there. And they often share regions, cities, and most of the time they have points of presence in the same cities, which basically means they do also share networks, cables basically. And during peak time, this can bring to peering congestion. Sorry, I have seen, this can bring to peering congestion, which basically means that everything will be slowed down simply because CDNs are sharing the same networks, and it's not your fault again, so you have no control over that, and you need to find a solution to it. Also, the type of content, and we're talking about very dynamic content or long-tail content, it doesn't really fit well with CDN. Again, you want to have control over it. But when we talk about performance, those 3 points are just 3 points. Like, performance definition is huge, and it really depends what you want to achieve. It might very well be that you want to have a better rendering time, you want to have a better time to first byte, or you want to reduce the number of calls against the origin servers. It's really up to you. And again, CDNs can't really help you that much in this. Third point, cost control. So that's quite obvious. Whenever you use a CDN, you pay for every gigabyte. And I think the cheapest one is something like 0.0002 cents per giga. But nowadays, we are constantly delivering data, and we're talking about terabytes, petabytes, all the time, 24 hours a day, all the year, and that's easily a lot of money involved in there. If you do implement your own CDN, obviously, at the very beginning, you will have to invest in infrastructure, maybe some new people in the team, maybe you will have to provide some training, but that's the initial investment. In the long run, you will actually have a full return on investment on that because you're not paying for every gigabyte you need to deliver, plus full control again. Fourth point, scale. Again, market is a little bit, not unstable, unpredictable, I will say. So if you have to decide nowadays how your audience will change in the future and how to scale your infrastructure, whenever you have to decide for a CDN provider, you gotta keep that in mind. Because CDN providers have points of presence pretty much all over the world, but it might very well be that with a single CDN provider, you can't really scale with as much freedom as you will do if you just implement your own CDN solution. Fifth point, that's a hot topic. Everyone is talking about CDNs and security. And that's because CDNs, again, are multi-tenant. So basically, they sell their services to several companies. And sometimes it might happen that content of a company is shared with content of another company. And that's obviously not good at all, no matter in which kind of field you're actually working. If you're streaming, you don't want your end user to actually access into something else, for instance, as an e-commerce website. You want your end user to be able to see the movie you're streaming. That's it. So if you want to have increased control, increased visibility, you probably want to have a look at these do-it-yourself CDNs. With the commercial CDNs, they do a good job against DOS attacks. But again, you don't have control on your own content. It's basically up to the CDN to decide, I'm going to cache this, sorry, this one is a cookie, or I'm going to remove this one, or this one will get into the cache in Singapore, the other one will get into the cache in Hong Kong. It's basically up to them. So you have no freedom over your content. That's mostly why huge players sort of decide, okay, we can't give this responsibility to a third party and also pay for that. Because sometimes they do make mistakes. So just to recap, if you sort of answer yes to any of those 5, and you want to have more control on any of those 5, you probably want to listen to me for the next 10, 15 minutes or so. Hopefully, even if you answer to no, you want to listen to me. So now we know that we need to build a do-it-yourself CDN, but the question is, how do we do it? What do we need? I've listened to another presentation, and the presenter was saying that CDNs are nothing but huge caches. And I sort of agree with that. But for this presentation, we're actually going to see what you really need to at least build a proof of concept for a do-it-yourself CDN. I can't really come up with a universal recipe because it really depends on the type of business you're running, the content you have, also the money you can actually invest in this, the time you have. It's really up to you, but there are some guidelines which hopefully will be helpful for you. So we basically need to understand which kind of hardware and software we need to buy. We need to understand where do we want to place our origin server and our points of presence, and we need to understand which CDN software we want to have in place. So hardware and software, that's a super easy example. You need to understand if you want to have bare metal or if you trust cloud providers. I'm a huge fan of the cloud providers, to be fair, because it's so easy. You just switch it on and off. But I sort of understand that if you have terabytes of content, you might prefer to have, or it might be cheaper to have bare metal in place. In this example, we have an origin server, the red one, and it's possibly somewhere in the Netherlands. Yeah, more or less, yes. And then we have 3 points of presence, one in South Africa, one in Australia, and one in New Zealand. So ideally, I think I will go for bare metal in Amsterdam, and if there is any cloud provider in South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, I will probably go for cloud providers. Otherwise, I will probably have to invest in bare metal and Teams as well. But I need to make sure the origin server is able to reach South Africa, Australia, and potentially Australia is a good caching point in order to be able to relay to New Zealand. But if Australia is down for any reason, I need to make sure that Amsterdam is able to send content to New Zealand. So other than hardware, you gotta also decide which kind of software you want to put in place for your CDN. So if a request comes in from Madagascar, my CDN needs to be able to redirect the user to South Africa, which is the closest point of presence in latency. So you also need to understand how the CDN needs to work, if it's either DNS-based or if it's based on geolocation or any other software. That's totally up to you. Again, I can't really come up with a recipe, but that's something you will have to research and understand what's the better solution for you, also based on the points of presence you're planning to have in the world. Origin server and POPs. Those questions, I'm not going to read all of them, but you can take a picture if you're interested in implementing a do-it-yourself CDN. I would say the trick is actually to draft a plan on where you wish to have your origin server and where you're planning to have your points of presence. You also need to measure the latency between your origin server and your audience. And based on that number, you can actually tweak a little bit your points of presence. Also, yeah, you also need to make sure, like there are regions such as Europe, which have good infrastructure. Other regions such as, I don't know, Africa, for instance, they have way worse infrastructure than in Europe. So that's something you will need to take into consideration for sure. You also need to take into consideration how many POPs do I want to start my hybrid CDN with. Am I planning to scale it at some point in time? What's the best way to scale this? Like, there are a lot of questions, but ideally you probably can, if you're in Europe, you can start out with origin server, whatever you're sitting in Europe, and points of presence basically everywhere in Europe, because you will have the cloud everywhere, and you can simply just switch it on and off and play with it. That's why a proof of concept is super easy to write, because you can simply buy an Amazon instance and play with that in Europe, East Coast, West Coast, and you can measure latency, you can measure time to first byte, and everything you need to have a good grasp on the whole project at least. CDN software. So how do we optimize this do-it-yourself CDN? So that's my only suggestion. Cache as much as you can. Ideally, you have your origin server somewhere in Europe or in the US, and all the other points of presence are nothing but huge caches, and they need to be available. So it can very well be that you have 2 points of presence in in Africa. And that's because if both points of presence are caches and one of those 2 suddenly dies, you still have the other one, and you're still able to reach your final user. So your origin server will push content to the caches, and in average, it takes something like 150 milliseconds to time to first byte. Average. It really then depends on where your origin server is and where your caches are. And then your caches can actually push content to your final users, and that takes something like 30 microseconds. Like, that's a huge improvement. So the cost for a CDN ideally should only be whenever you need to generate content from your origin server to your caches. And then you'll have points of presence doing the work for you, but they need to be available all the time. And you obviously need to consider to have CDN software that provides you availability all the time, because again, if you have 2 caches and one dies, the other one will need to be able, first of all, to cope with the request, number of incoming requests, but also it will have to be able to deliver content to the final user. You want to have secure connection. That's for sure, because you are a CDN, you're delivering content, and also, I don't know if you knew, but for instance, on mobile connection, which by 2020, mobile connection will actually, mobile users will be higher than desktop user, but on mobile connection, encrypted data goes faster than unencrypted data. Because mobile carriers, they have infrastructure, they have proxies in place, and unencrypted data will have to go through proxies, and this slows down the whole process a little bit, while encrypted data will simply bypass those proxies. So that's like a performance tweak that some companies are actually applying. Plus, HTTP2 is coming, and that's all HTTPS. So, yeah, so up till now, we sort of understood that you have 5 points to keep into consideration whenever you're planning a private or hybrid CDN. And there are only 3 points you will have to plan around if you have decided you need a hybrid or private CDN. So now I have like a small use case, and it is about a famous company doing very nice electrical cars. And they approached us a few years ago. I think it was 2014-15. I honestly don't remember. Well, turns out that they have started out on the west coast of the US, and now they have a huge market in China, and I think in the whole Scandinavia, at least in Norway, the market is huge. And the website, on their website, they have a lot of videos, images. I think the biggest data they need to stream is 1.7 gigabytes, and streaming from the west coast to Norway, it's quite a long run, I would say. So they sort of understood we have a beautiful car, very performant, but our website is not as performant as the cars we're trying to sell. Also, they wanted to have control on the data, because I don't know if you knew, but the cars sometimes push data to the origin server on the west coast to the US, and they have implemented their own maps, and that's how the cars are able to drive you around, because they're constantly pushing data to Mountain View or over there somewhere, and based on that, you don't really need to drive your car anymore. Obviously, they couldn't really rely on a third-party CDN because of price, because if you constantly need to push data back and forth, that's super expensive. Because they wanted to have control over the data they were pushing, because that's private user information. You can't just cache it, or you can cache it, but you need to be responsible for what you're doing. They want to have visibility, privacy in place, and make sure they were 100% able to have full control of their own CDN. So basically what they implemented is they still have an origin server on the west coast of the US, but now they have a lot of points of presence in the Nordics and in China. And they have a full private CDN. Like, there is no third party anymore involved. And they're not that, like, the team, I think the proof of concept has been developed in 5 hours by a single engineer. Then obviously we had worked together for a while in order to tweak the corner cases, as you probably very well know, tweaking and being able to make sure that the corner cases are very well covered. It takes way more time than actually preparing a proof of concept. And nowadays, after a few years, they're still running their own private CDN. They have persistent in place, so basically the origin server push content to any other points of presence. And the points of presence in Europe, they do take care of people in Europe. Points of presence in China, they do take care of people in China and anywhere else surrounding China. And the same for Europe. I think it's it is a four tires CDN, and they do, the user is redirected based on geolocation. And they have a little bit of caching in place, but really it was a matter of 5 hours. There is actually a good presentation by their engineer. So that's pretty much it. I hope I managed to sort of at least made it a little bit interesting. If not, at least you have the airplane's story. That's always good. I'm very much open to question, like now or later in the day. My plane, I'm flying back to Italy very late tonight, so I'll be here the whole afternoon. Feel free to ask anything. No? Okay.
No?
Well, thank you very much then.
Thank you.
Thank you.